For us at EHR, at Emergency Architecture and Human Rights is a statement. Architecture is a human right. But we want to open this and try to make us question, is architecture a human right? Architecture is an accumulate knowledge, and all accumulate knowledge has to have the possibility to be used by everybody as much they want, when they want, and where they want. Classrooms, it's one of the main infrastructure that it's needed now. Architecture is a tool to promote human rights. We think that architecture is a human right.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this appointment of the ACC lectures. I wish to thank, as always, the curatorial team of the PhD students who have organized and curated everything. Thank you also to the students who have produced the video that allowed us to get to know Michele before his lecture. And of course, I wish to thank our guest for today's lecture, Michele Di Marco. Thank you so much for being here. I will be very brief in my introduction, since the video already gave us, let's say, the atmosphere of your intervention, of your lecture. Just a few words. So Michele Di Marco defines himself, I really like this definition, as a true internationalist who believes in the power of networking and a multidisciplinary approach. He is, in fact, a former student of Politecnico di Torino, where he obtained his bachelor in architecture. In fact, we studied together. And then he moved on to UAV in Venice, in Chile, and many other international destinations. Michele is teaching now in several universities on the topics of architecture, human rights, emergency response, and disaster risk reduction. Just a few words about his two main activities. From September 2019, after being the director of the international operations for 3 years, he became the CEO of Emergency Architecture and Human Rights, EHR. The particularity of this practice, of this organization, Emergency Architecture and Human Rights, is that the projects that they undertake must challenge directly at least one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the UN Agenda. Also, Michele is part of the founding team behind TECNE, the World Health Organization Technical Science for Health Network, where he works on engineering control for infectious diseases, and he coordinates TECNE members' operations and activities. Okay, so I think that I will definitely leave the floor to Michele now. Thank you again for being here, and please. No, Michele, we cannot hear you.
First of all, thank you for the. Sorry, just 1 second, because I can hear myself actually.
No, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Well, first of all, like, thank you for the introduction, Valeria, and of course, like, you mentioned just my name, but like behind all of this, there is a great team. There is the team of emergency architecture and human rights, and I think this is worth it, to mention. Thank you to the Politecnico of Turin for the invitation to me and to emergency architecture and human rights. But thank you, and mostly like to all of you, to the students. You are and will be the beaten heart of this university and the future society. So many of you today will start to think at the relation. What does it mean, this relation between architecture and human rights? And while I'm going through the presentation, I would like that all of you will have this question in mind. And surely there will be, of course, like many different answers to that question and to that combination, to that relation between architecture and human rights. So thinking about how architecture is related to human rights give us the possibility of articulating some answers. The point of view that will be presented today, and this at the base of the foundation of emergency architecture and human rights, is what you also heard in the video. It's define architecture as an accumulate knowledge, and so a tool that everyone has the right to use. And therefore, like if used properly, and I will mention this more and more, if used properly, can be used to defend human rights, to foster human rights. So in different parts of the world and in different historical moments, architecture has been used as a tool for social change. And this is the meaning that we are basically built upon what was already existing and happening in the history. But today, like, let's start, we are in the middle of the pandemic that it's affecting the whole world. So like today, I want to start with one right, the right to health. And this is, I think it's important to understand that disease outbreak in cities in general, spaces are somehow bonded, and they have had a very long relationship. Starting from you can see like a photo, like, a picture here in the presentation, starting from the typhoid fever in Athens of the 4th century, which decimated its population by 2/3. The Hansen disease during the Middle Age. Of course, the Black Death, a spread of the bubonic plague. That was spreading actually like around the world and killed around 1/3 of the population of Europe and caused the collapse of the federal system, the economic structure, and the redistribute the demographic. And I mentioned this because it's actually, like what's happening here with the COVID, with this pandemic, is not just an health crisis. And of course, we can continue the 7 cholera pandemic. We are actually in this moment in the 7th cholera pandemic that was impulsing, as we will see now, like the creation of new sewage and water treatments all around the world. But I want to start like with this map, with this because this is very interesting, because the map, it's at the base of the epidemiological studies. So starting from the story, what is the story about this map? On the 31st of August, 1854, after several other outbreaks that had occurred in London, a major outbreak of cholera occurred in Soho, in one of the neighborhoods of London. And in 3 days, just after 3 days, the 31st of August, 1854, 127 people died around the Broader Street. You can see that there is a point where written pump around there. During the week after, 3/4 of the residents had fled the area. People leave. And after 10 days, 500 people died, with a mortality of around 12.8% in some part of the city. So by talking with the residents at that moment, a doctor was called John Snow, identified the sources of the outbreak as the public water pump in Broader Street, between Broader Street and Cambridge Street. That is the dot that you can see in the middle of the map. And it turned out that the water from the pump was polluted by a sewage from the nearby chest pits where a baby nappy contaminated with cholera has been dumped. And thanks to this map, there were major changes and improvements both in the public health and the infrastructure departments. But even more, thanks to this map, and so this collaboration between the building environment sector, the understanding of the environment, the space, and the reason behind the infrastructure and the infection disease, so the health part, the public health part, it was understood that cholera is basically a waterborne disease. And we can continue, always stick to London, and over decades, the River Thames had effectively become the London largest open sewage. But it wasn't until the Great Stink, as was called the Thames in that moment for the smell that was emanate, and in the summer of 1854, there was decided, was forced the Parliament to close. And of course, the Londoners at that moment decide to do something about it, the city sanitation crisis. And in that moment, actually, you can see a small phrase, old smeller disease, because unable to ignore the stank of the Thames. And at that moment, there was a real fearful of the miasmatic belief, a kind of miasmatic belief that all smell are diseases. The Parliament sanctioned one of the century-great engineering projects, so the all new sewage network for London that didn't exist before. And this, of course, was connected with the rapid growth of London that was not accompanied by the infrastructure improvements. So the huge amount of sewage produces each day, it was not going in a parallel way to the improvement of the infrastructure of the whole city. And that was, of course, contributing to the wave of cholera outbreaks and other public health crises, as we mentioned before. And this is something, if you know, and if you look, it's at what's happening also around the world, it's actually exactly the same that it's happening now and was happening from that moment. So they decide to build brick wall sewage tunnel, which allowed the system to cope with the increasing volume of waste. So the new sewage system was opened finally in the 1865. In the following years, that had a huge contribution of reducing the transmission of cholera within the city. And that was actually saw it because the male parts that was actually affected by cholera, in the next years, was just the east of London, the part that actually was not connected to the new sewage system. And if we are flying to the other sides of the Atlantic, and we go to the end of the 18th centuries, Philadelphia was the most dense planned city, and at that moment also the capital of the US. But at the same time, it was the hottest city, and it was between all the Atlantic sea coast. And the city was surrounded by swamp with open sewage. Liquid and waste were basically thrown into all dug into the ground and also captured runoff. Residents store the rainwater in barrel, and that was the perfect way of providing breeding ground to the mosquitoes. So all of that was provided the best way to basically transmit what we call yellow fever. And in the 1793 in Philadelphia, between August and November, Philadelphia became a huge epicenter of yellow fever epidemic. And also in that case,
what was started, to be done, looking actually at the reason why there was such huge epicenter, became such a huge epicenter in Philadelphia, is because the city developed exclusively along the river, with a great density nearby the port, where you see actually the red area on the first map on the left. And the density close to a river had deadly implication when mosquito carry out like a yellow fever, like from the ship coming from the Caribbean, and sailors were actually the one residing in the boarding houses nearby the ports. So in 1793, 10% of the population died. Looking at Philadelphia, the whole US, the whole United States, the state of America, was doubting if they should become an urban nation, and the authority of Philadelphia were asking themselves how they can reinvent themselves. Can Philadelphia reinvent themselves? And this is actually what they started to do, like in 1795, where they established a board of public health. And the epidemic results in a number of innovative measures, such the creation, as you can see in the map, of 5 parks that help reducing standing water, and the first municipal water system in the country. So again, you can see that because of a pandemic, because of an epidemic, like when there is a strict relation with another discipline, and work in a multidisciplinary way, of course, considering also the transformation of the space, there are very big invention, and there is a new way of rethinking and improved conditions. So in an extraordinary, innovative vision of the progressive technology and civitas. So, and of course, an amazing answer to who, at the beginning, do you remember the question, can Philadelphia reinvent themselves? And the other question, can the US should become a city nation or not? And yes, of course, the answer was through the innovation vision of Philadelphia, that actually the US needed a city. And of course, Venice, from where the word quarantine is coming from. Many of us heard these words millions of times during the last years. So the word quarantine actually is coming from quarantenas, is meaning like the 40 days. And it was used in the 14th and the 15th centuries, like by Venetian, to designate the period that all ships were required to be isolated before, like passengers and crew, but also the staff. So to assure, during the Black Death plague epidemic. So in the middle of 14th century, Venice was struck by the bubonic plague that we were mentioning at the beginning, part of the outbreak known as the Black Death. So this spread was just one of the several waves of the plague that struck the north of Italy in the century, and that followed Venice as a trading center. So Venice was really affected because it was the trading center of that area, especially, and was started to become extremely vulnerable to that. So when at the beginning of the 15th century, the devastating plague outbreak hit Venice and killed the Doge, it was actually the head of the states at the time. It was called Giovanni Moncenigo. Venice government built a public hospital in Lazzaretto Vecchio. So to isolate infection and curb the disease of the disease. So the Senate decides at that moment to convert and transform an island, within the Venetian lagoon, that was called Santa Maria di Nazareth, to host the first in the world hospital to treat plague infected people. So give them a place to quarantine, but also at the same time, as was mentioned before, to decontaminate goods. And after the period of 65 years, was built another facilities that was called Lazzaretto Novo. And it became obligatory, like it became mandatory stop for every ship arriving to the region in order to get health check. So thanks to this policy, Venetians were able to curb the damage as the plague struck Europe again and again during the whole Renaissance. So together, this island became the center of the Venetian vast public health response to the plague, and building on early tradition of separating the sick from the healthy, the Venetian government became the first in the Mediterranean region to systematically use large-scale methods of isolation and information collecting and monitoring, and to fight the infection disease. This is actually what's happening in a different way, of course, like now during the pandemic or during any epidemic. So the effort was even more impressive because at that time, the science couldn't explain how disease spreads. The germ theory was discovered 400 years after. So Venice became was the cornerstone for the creation and development of isolation facilities around the globe, from major public building to entire islands, as we saw with the Lazaretto Nuovo, Lazaretto Vecchio, serving the old health infrastructure system. So this was actually one of the main and the first way to rethink in space because an infection disease, because an epidemic or a pandemic. And I want to pass, of course, to another right, the right to housing and the right to live. So beginning with the Industrial Revolution, several utopians and activists in the United States and, of course, United Kingdom warned and fought for the right to housing, the right to work, the pursuit of health and well-being in the urban life in general, which was at the base for a series of urban movements that after were developed during the 20th and 21st centuries. And this is like a picture of Ancoats, the Ancoat area in the city of Manchester. And was one of the first industrial suburbs in the world, made up of small terraced houses where workers from the nearby area, where the workers were moving from the countrysides into the city to start working into the nearby factories. So in the 1878, started a worker political mobilization and sanitation effort to rebuild the working class neighborhoods, led them to participation in a local election and under the leadership of actually a very interesting person that is called Charles Robley, who became the started, and the rethinking the unhealthy area of Ancoat. It was a very interesting and successful campaign to achieve better living standard, healthy homes and environments. And of course, Copenhagen, because our organization is actually based in Copenhagen, in Denmark. And in Copenhagen, the over-densification and poor condition of working class housing as a result of the explosive growth of the population within the walled city produces a cholera epidemic in the 1853, which influences the need to dismantle the fortification in Copenhagen. So it was a delayed decision, as for decades it was being considered an urgent need. As a result of the epidemic, a new meat market and safer water supply was built in the 1857, and the society completed the first stage of housing projects considered the birth of social housing in Denmark. So in the 1890, the first Danish national legislation was passed to provide cheap home loan aimed at work association. And it's interesting because actually happened much before the booming of the social housing that actually happening after the Second World War, where there was the need of building affordable houses in a very fast manner. And of course, the devastation, the herbicides, the product of the World War II led to a global movement for social rights. The United Nations General Assembly on the 10th of December 1948 adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is actually what our organization, Emergency Architecture and Human Rights, is building upon, which is the document that direct decision-making, public policy of the country and the effort civil association in the world. The Article 25, that actually is the direct link and the first link between architecture and human rights, indicate that all people have the right to an adequate standard of living that ensure them as well their family, health and well-being, food, clothing, housing, medical assistance, and necessary social service. Of course, this is the direct, when it's talking about shelter, it's talking about protection, but all of that, it can be, as we mentioned before, is the right to health, is the right to living adequately. So between the 1950 and the 1970, I was mentioned before, there were built, was the booming of the social housing construction, were built 40 million houses within Europe, 34 million in the east of Europe, and 6 million in the west of Europe. So this was a need, an urgent need, that there was, because there was a need to rebuild a continent, an entire continent, in a fast and affordable way. And after the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, with the influence of the neoliberalism, and of course, the Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, that the most influencing architects passed from working from the public sector to the private sector. Everyone, the new graduates, want to become architects because it's what we were teaching into the university, pushing so the cold public of social architecture in its own darkest periods. But of course, all of this, history, are like waves. Our approaches tends to be like waves. And in 2000, a new interest in social architecture booming out, which can be observed in international competitions such as, or international exhibition, such as the Venice Biennale, the Documenta in Kassel, the art exhibition Documenta in Kassel, stated as South at State of Mind, or the Venice exhibition, the Venice Biennale, Less Aesthetic, More Ethics. And of course, the Pritzker Prize as a symbol to Alejandro Ravenna and Shigeru Ban for their project of social impact and public interest. But what about now? What's happening now in our historical moment? So this year, there has been a radical change in the way we inhabited our city and our home during the pandemic, as we all were affected, actually. So with approximately 90% of the all COVID cases reported in urban area, urban area have become the epicenter of the pandemic. The size of the population and their high level of global and local interconnectivity, as we remember was the case of Venice, and is why it was so vulnerable to the plague, make them particularly vulnerable to the spreading of the virus. So in short term, for many cities, the COVID-19 health crisis has expanded, as was in the case of Europe during the bubonic plague, during the Black Death, into a crisis of urban access, urban equity, urban finance, security, unemployment, public services, infrastructure, transportation, and all of which is disproportionately affects the most vulnerable population in society. So this crisis has made us reflect on whatever city, as we know now, as we know them now, are an obsolete systems that require major transformation. So as we saw in our history, various disease, plague, war, or catastrophes, disaster in general, have made us reorganize cities, create new system, create new typology. And in the same way, this pandemic has made us thinking about questioning the place and the way we work, where we study, leisure spaces, how the commerce develop, and how we inhabited our home, our private spaces. But at the same time, this makes us rethinking about density and extension of cities, and about the elements or pieces that compose all of this. So they are the building, the park, public spaces, streets. But during 2020 and from when the pandemic starts, there were like a lot of webinars about post-COVID cities and how these post-COVID cities be like. So the pandemic actually, like in fact a small virus called SARS-CoV-2, has exposed the fragility of infrastructure and urban services in much of the city, making the deficit carry over decades evident. This is not something that is coming because or just because the pandemic. The pandemic presented as an opportunity to correct all of that, or at least to transform some of that, especially in the most vulnerable sector. So before the pandemic, there was already the idea of creating a city where all needs were covered by the famous 15 minutes walk city. So this distribution could, of course, like solve several of the problems in the city, distributing the uses in more like an equitable way in the territory. With the pandemic, the idea of metropolis as a system of interconnected and self-sufficient neighborhoods has emerged as a possibility to stop future pandemic, or at least to limit the transmission in future pandemic and be a catalyst for decentralization. But in addition, the pandemic made visible that the need to improve the quality standards of home, common spaces, our streets, our health facilities. And just as the hygienist theory influences modernist aesthetic, for example, in the case of tuberculosis, where sanatorium, bathroom, large green area were designed out of the fear of diseases, this pandemic has made us reflect on the need for fresh air, more balconies, wider sidewalks, private outdoor, public and private outdoor spaces. And public spaces and green area have been seen as the place to communicate. There was very interesting analysis done, for example, in Denmark, looking at the booming of the use of public spaces during the pandemic times. So share and carry out, like a place where to share and carry out activities, reducing the risk of transmission that is, of course, higher when we are talking about indoor spaces. But I also believe that we must go beyond all of this and understand that the crisis as a structural problem of urban inequality. So as we saw in the last month, this is not a normal time. And in the last month, not the last one. In the last month, this is not like a normal time. So what we do in the next years will echo through the generation that will come after us. So today, I also want to introduce into the discussion what I actually introduced before. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is still, at least for us, but for many, like the North Star that should guide our generation and the future generation that will come. So we must bet on cities that inspire and mobilize others to overcome threats such inadequate health system, gaps in the social protection, structural inequality, environmental degradation, climate crisis, that unfortunately we are tend to forget during the pandemic. So COVID-19 is shining, we can say, a spotlight on this injustice. So we've been brought to our knees by a microscopic virus. The pandemic has demonstrated the fragility of our world, and definitely we can say that inequality defines our time. So foods, healthcare, water, sanitation, education, decent work, social securities are not commodity to sell to those who can afford them, but are basic human rights to which we are all entitled. So that vision is important today as it was 73 years ago when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written. So part of our collective memory can be seen in our city. The way we build and the way our urban life unreveals its products of past experience. We easily forget as the time passes, but many of the measures we take to reduce seem to be more and more forgotten. So therefore, beyond learning from the past, we must be prepared for the future. And this is a big possibility for now, in this moment. We must put resilience at the center of our culture while framing it as a right and not only the right to the city, but the right to a healthy city. And I want to end this chapter of the presentation with a poem written by a good friend and a brilliant professor from the Copenhagen University. It's called Emmanuel Raggio. And he wrote this poem just at the beginning of the pandemic. And he actually say, I left my home, my people, and my land, searching for a ray of hope, a light through the tunnel. I fled poverty and marginalization. I fled looking for hope. I made a bed in a slum, as they call. I shared the shower with 1 million others. I shared my space with 10 others. Space. Yes, just a 15 square meter and a loft with another few men. Under the sheets of tin, we cooked, we ate, and we worked. Fire and flood, who care? The virus come, they care. Not about me, but the virus might come into their home. Told me to stay home. They call it social distancing. They get paid for that. I don't. And if we all stayed home in the slum, how do we distance? Clean water, I never saw that before. How do I wash my hands for 20 seconds without water? I don't get to it because I have to stay home. What do? Walk home, no matter to the distance. It was a few 100 kilometers I succeeded, no matter the heat. I collapsed as one, some water came, then some food. Thank you, Good Samaritan. Then come the barricade to stop me, the migrants. Then come the sanitizer for the buses, but they spread on me. Then come the cane, the police parades of power asking why I'm walking. Because I cannot work from home. And if I don't work, I don't eat. They closed the border and they sacked of my real home gone. Even if I had the virus, nobody cared because I've left the city. No water, no soap, no distancing. Unemployed, unpaid, and starved. The poverty, my darkest fear that I fled. I see it coming again, but I walk home, the long walk home. And so I think it's very clear after that it's not just about health crisis. So what post-COVID city be like? The truth is that they will be very similar to current city if the political, economical model and decision-making are not discussed. There will be no fair city if the privatization of social rights and common good is not reversed, if democracy is not radicalized, and if everyone is not recognized as equal in the city. And we can say that city is an inherently political, ideological, social product, and putting it in a preferably technical sphere of neo-hygienist urban planning will be nothing more than a new infertile reflection. We will also realize that it cannot be a discussion between politician and technician. It must be built collectively in a multidisciplinary manner. It is then the time to rethink the answer, but of course, and most than everything, to rethink the questions. And then we'll pass to the last rights of today. There are many more, but we don't have enough time. And I would like to end to the right of education. One of the most important rights if we don't to lose the future generation, if we want to foster all the other rights. Emergency Architecture and Human Rights launched this year in the middle of the pandemic, the Classroom for All initiative. And the reasons will be very clear in the next slide that I will show. More than 170 million children are not enrolled in pre-primary education, missing a critical investment opportunity and suffering deep inequality from the start. From a very interesting UNESCO report states that only 6 on 10 children leave primary school without achieving minimum proficiency level in reading and math. Today, there are 1.2 billion young people between 15 and 24 years, which account the 16% of the whole global population. But in 2030, looking at the same age range, the projection will grow to 1.3 million. Moreover, building and keep the physical facility for educational purpose account as the second large element of the education system after the salary of teachers. So in the emergency context, the limited financial inputs led the humanitarian agency to invest the fund into educational activities rather than the facilities themselves. So Classroom for All, I was mentioned before, it's a multi-stakeholder initiative that aims to increase access to quality education through the improvement of learning facilities for children living in vulnerable settings. So by promoting local-led response, it works to strengthen the local community's resilience and capacity, the local community capacity and resilience to manage the risk and opportunity in the face of recurrent crisis in vulnerable setting. Are they crises due to the natural hazards, or pandemics, epidemics, conflicts, etc.? So the initiative does not only aim to provide classrooms that are safe against natural hazard, infection, disease, etc., but also to educate and to share knowledge with the local community to basically make them resilient to all these challenges. So a safer classroom can save the life of children, but at the same time, it can provide a safer space for the local community in a time of an emergency, a flooding, an earthquake, etc. Serve as a temporary shelter while the community is basically wait for normalcy and after the disaster. But the process behind the implementation of each project for us is as important as the reason why we are doing and the final result. So as we said, we provide safe and quality education space and learning facility for children, but at the same time, we are trying to strengthen resilience of local people living in vulnerable settings. So all of that is possible thanks to all participatory engagement activities, capacity building training, and awareness activities on adaptation that are done during the process. So, and of course, finalizing on the co-construction activities through employment following the mechanism of cash for work. But of course, design, when it's an extremely important aspect when talking about disaster risk reduction. It's a fundamental element. It's not the only one, but it's a fundamental element. And it's for this reason like that to reduce the cost and the response time, we are working and building a matrix to facilitate the design process, both in the technical parts and during the co-design together with and they can be used during the co-design together with the local community. The matrix is extremely useful to speed up the process in the case of emergency, because but at the same time, without forgetting the area where we are going to implement the project or where the intervention will be done, will take place. So the matrix also helps us to choose the right local material, the low-tech construction available in the area to face, and they can able to respond and to increase the resilience of the building infrastructure to the different hazards. So together actually with the Politecnico of Turin, we started a series of theses. The first one was on participation, and the other 4 that actually are ongoing will be on the use of material and technology. So we are now developing a model that could be adapted to different area and intervention based on culture, climate, and different hazards. The first prototype will be actually built in Kireka, in nearby Kampala, in Uganda. And together with the local organization, it's called She4She, we are working on providing safer spaces where girls and women can learn about menstrual health, as the main reason why girls, for example, lose class days in the so-called period of shame. So when they have actually the menstrual period. She4She is our partner. It's working hard from several years on this topic. And now is the time for them to have a learning center where to advocate around this topic. And at the same time, the facility will host menstrual pad production area where the women from the community will have the possibility to increase their livelihoods through the production of textile and the reusable menstrual pads. Of course, as stated before, like also in the case of Uganda, it's extremely important to provide safer educational spaces. So of course, we are going to use the matrix, and we are looking now at the different challenges within the area, going and spanning from natural hazards. Are they like geophysical? So for example, earthquake, landslide, hydrological. So for example, flood, climate, meteorological, like cyclone, storm, but at the same time biological. So for example, disease epidemic, infection disease, etc., etc. So this is the matrix result. It's just a draft still for Uganda. And that is for us always the first step of the design process, where we choose material and techniques will be able to enable us to go into technical detail to face the hazard. So the color one icons are the one we take into consideration, and the gray one are the ones that we discarded because they are not relevant to the topic, to the place. So as mentioned, as the beginning of the Classroom for All, Classroom for All, it's a multi-stakeholder initiative where are involved the humanitarian, the private, and the academic sector. In a time of rapid change, it is impossible to work alone. I think it was very clear during the whole presentation. It's impossible to simplify complexity. We have to deal with complexity, and the only way to do it is in a multidisciplinary manner. So to finalize today, what I would like to ask you is to believe that together we can build better and healthy cities and environments. But here, what no single organization can do. This requires active participation. So I ask you to work together, as we already started, for example, in the case of Politecnico of Turin, with the Classroom for All initiative. Today, I ask you to believe in your personal and collective capacity to assume your own responsibility as a citizen before then as a professionals. We have to work together. We have to think and solve the challenges of our time together if we want healthier cities and healthier spaces that can be resilient to pandemic, they can be resilient to different natural hazards, and can increase more than everything equality and foster human rights. We belong to each other, we stand together, or we fall apart. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Michele. Thank you really for an inspiring lecture, I would say, that really took us across the map of a geographical map and also time map, and that particularly prompts us to reflect on and discuss the agency of architecture as a social tool, no? To rethink architecture as a social tool. So I would have a million questions, but I would like to leave the floor to the students. I know for sure that there are some students who will have questions, but of course I prompt all of the others to join in the discussion as well. Please, if you want to open your cameras and mix. Okay.
Okay, hi. Can I start?
Sure.
Yes. Okay, I am from Group 25. First of all, I want to thank Michele for the speech. And I have a question for him. As you mentioned, in the 20th century, the social housing projects increased to solve the housing deficit. Some of these projects, with the pass of the time, were abandoned and demolished, like Poorly Lock in the USA, designed by Minoru Yamasaki. And even today, in Latin American countries, the government builds social housing projects for vulnerable communities, and these are abandoned or had problems of insecurity, among others. So, which strategies or methodologies must be implemented to guarantee quality of life and resilience of these kind of projects throughout the time and people's lifestyle change?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Lina. I think you know, like the challenge of like the social housing, it's span from the construction sides, the social sides, and at the same times culturally. No, I was working for quite a bit, for example, in Chile. And one of the main problem when talking about, not always, fortunately, but sometimes when talking about social housing, especially like when like moving people, resettle people from informal settlement to affordable housing, was that like there was a completely destruction of the social connectivities when passing from the informal settlement, when everyone is fighting for a common objective, that is basically to have good affordable housing, when they're passing to really having the house in itself. So first of all, it's how we are including the people and the community in the use and in the design of this social housing. If we are talking about existing social housing, you know, of course, this social housing, they have, you know, more or less in Europe, 70 years. So of course they are in need of restoration. And another place where I was working, for example, in Latvia, in the case of microrayon, that it's not just about the construction in society, but it's also about economics, you know? So basically, these social housing, because were built 70 years ago, they are now nearby the center of cities. So in very valuable land. And what's happening there, right? Of course, there are private investors that want to rethink these spaces because, for example, the microrayon have like a very big courtyard that was actually the social space for people. That this being an empty part will be very good for the private investor to build on the top. So it's always like a kind of mix between the private investors, the people living there, and the community, and what is the government, municipalities, and of course the designer or architect, together with all these different stakeholders, as a role as a kind of mediator into that. But you know, if you really want to talk about strategy, you know, the main thing is that we cannot exclude any of these stakeholders if you want, not even the private sector, you know, because it's where there is the money, and the majority of like the knowledge in relation with construction, for example. So like all these elements have to be at stakeholder, have to sit around the table to discuss and find the common balance between the wish of all the different actors. But like it's extremely important to involve the community at the same times.
Thank you so much, Michele.
I can ask a question now, I think.
Yes.
My question is more about the logistics of how this works. Because all around the world, there are so many natural disasters and so many immigration problems. How do you assess these communities that are in need, and how do you choose and reach out to them to implement the project?
Well, first of all, there is no natural disasters. There are natural hazards. Because natural hazard became a disaster just when, you know, like was very interesting worker masons like in Nepal, actually one time told me, the problem is not the earthquake. The problem is that the roof is falling on the head of people. But in relation with that, you know, of course, there are several international organizations. For example, there is a very interesting organization, agency, that is called UNDRR, that is basically like they assess and set like standards and way of working with disaster risk reduction. And of course, like we as an international organization, we cannot work, and we are not actually interested in working alone without a local partner. So it's really a close relationship between the international organization and the local partners. Of course, like when you're asking about how you choose it and how you prioritize, of course, like there are two main elements. One is who is more in need, and that, you know, like you can find several reports that are done. But at the same time, it's what could be funded for our specialty in emergency architecture and human rights. Because of course we cannot solve the problem of the world. We are just like small piece of a very big mosaic. But what we are trying to do is basically to really trying to capacity building and strengthen the resilience of the local community so that in theory and in the best scenario, there will be in the future no needs of emergency architecture in human rights.
Thank you.
I guess I'll go next. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your lecture. It was very informative and we've been very looking forward to it. So during the lecture, you mentioned several important topics which are connected to each other, and you emphasized their urgency in working together in order to establish a collaborative network. So my question would be, how do you think we can achieve the multidisciplinary collaboration in order to establish the necessary urban infrastructure for epidemic control in the post-COVID city?
This is interesting question, thank you. And actually, like exactly because that was missing, like what we are trying to do, like within the other job, like at the World Health Organization, is to basically created a network that is called Technical Science for Health Network, where there are universities and technical institutions that are support the World Health Organization in supporting different Ministry of Health, different UN agencies. And within the group, of course, there are engineers, there are architects, there are epidemiologists, there are medical doctors, there are urban planners, and there are sometimes anthropologists, wash experts, etc. And this is extremely important. But like I think the main thing, if I can suggest something, like while you are in your study, is basically to be curious on everything that is not strictly related to your background. Because now we are talking about health, but we can perfectly talking about urban farming, and what does it mean about knowing about sustainable farming? And I can go on with many of this example. All this, we have to be a bit more multidisciplinary ourselves to work in a multidisciplinary way. And this, I think, it was the old way of thinking. The job of the architect, of course, is going like more and more into the specialization. But the architect was a kind of actor that knew about several topics, and that's like openness of our profession. I think is extremely important, extremely relevant, like nowadays, because the world is becoming too complex and is going too fast that it's impossible to deal just with one discipline. It's literally impossible.
Thank you.
Hi, hello. So I actually have a question perhaps related to the pace of how urbanization is changing currently in the world, that urban analysts are saying that by the end of 2050, most of the world population will actually move to the urban, like 75%, some huge number like that. What are some measures that designers and architects or students should aim for the next 3 decades in terms of to revive the gap between the socioeconomical classes that has been happening for almost a century now?
There is actually one of the board members of Emergency Architecture and Human Rights called Clean Kleinschmidt. He was the camp manager of Zaatari camp, very high-ranking UNHCR worker. That is developing together with another group what is called sustainable development zones. And it is basically how you are already trying to map where people, because of the migration that is due to climate change, economic, etc., like will go, and try to think how the city in itself as a connected body can be recipients to different kind of people coming into the city. So already start preparing the city for the newcomers. And this is, something that's, we all know from 20 years that the urban population will increase exponentially. But what we are doing, what we were doing until now, is very little. Also, the other thing is, how we can think decentralization, and this is nothing new. All the nice small cities and villages that you see around Europe, in France, in Spain, in Italy, this medieval village, they were slums or informal settlement outside the city wall. After the city, why they were there? Because they could work there, they could farm for the people living inside, or because there was the castle, or because there was the abbey or the church, etc. After the wall expands, they enter within the wall, the city wall, and of course they change. They will not be anymore built in wood, but they were started to be built in bricks. This is actually exactly the same that it's happening in many informal settlements around the world. Exactly the same process. Like if you are looking at, like the informal settlement in Chile or in Argentina, it's very different from the informal settlement you can see in Rio de Janeiro, for example, Rocinha. So, and all this, it's something that we all know where it's going. It's just, how we can create this kind of sponge-like cities that can be able to absorb like the influx of people.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for your questions. Are there others among the students?
Hello. Can I? Thank you for your lectures. And my question is related to classrooms for all. You already answered my question, but I will ask anyway. So my question is, how can we structure and organize the participation of young people in this project? For example, what is the key element to make them actors, but at the same time, the end users, the key element? Thank you.
When you're talking about young people, you're talking about the beneficiaries or all of you, for example?
All of them, the workers, but the children's.
Okay, the beneficiary. Okay, yeah. Of course, like the participation is not starting from the design. The participation is starting from a co-assessment. Let's say, what are the challenges? It's very easy to say you have these challenges and are going to solve your challenges that I know from here. Of course, you can do a desk research to have an understanding, but after it's very important to go to the field and do like what we call what the Red Cross is called vulnerability capacity assessment. So it's a series of tools that are used to assess and to let the community self-assess what are their needs. This is the first step. And after, of course, like we can pass to the co-creation, to the design co-creation process. In the case of Classroom for All, it's not like a 100% co-creation process, but just because we want to arrive to much people as possible. So basically, there are a certain part that is fixed, that is based on the matrix, because it's basically technical part. So how a structure with a certain kind of material will resist to a cyclone, right? There are some technical things that we can already, as part of the matrix, can develop. But there are certain other parts that are where the co-creation part in the design and in all the different tools within the assessment are extremely important to basically like increase the ownership of the communities, because at the end we are going to leave a certain point after the evaluation process, and is the community or the local organization that we are working with always, they are going to stay and use the infrastructure or use the facility itself. So there are different times for engagement and participation. And of course, there are different age at the same time. For example, with the workers, there is all the element of training, capacity building in in the use of local materials, to use local material in a safer way. But with the children, for example, and we can work as, for example, we did with the thesis of Giulio. That was a student from Politecnico of Turin that was working with us, like on how to engage through games, like the children's. So, but it's not just an engagement, but at the same time, this is a learning process. So, for example, you are teaching them like how you can increase the resilience through like small games and small drawings, like funny drawings, like how you can increase the resilience of a house, for example, or whatever, like to flooding or to earthquake. Very simple solution, like two very small models, etc., etc. But a different tool that can be used.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. In the last year, it has been designed thinking and designing architecture and environments with more common space intended for coexistence and the sociality between the people. But after about 1 year of the spread of pandemic and the social distancing, will the way of designing change? Or once of the crisis has passed, will we go back to planning as before?
Good questions. Well, like I hope, as was mentioned before in the presentation, that we are learning from what is happening, from knowing that is not the first and will be not the last time that a pandemic or epidemic will happen. There was tuberculosis, Spanish fever, just to talk about the cholera, just to talk about the last one. And this is just looking at Europe, because, for example, in certain countries in Africa, they are every year. And now, for example, we are working on like Ebola crisis in Guinea and Sierra Leone, etc. I hope that this will change. I hope that the design will change. But I think it's not just a matter of design. It's a mindset that should be changed. You know, like if I have to design a school, I want in my group people that are not just architects and engineers. This first step, it's actually quite important. And after, of course, there will be better design, like less good design, but this is okay. This is what's happening in general, in our business in general, right? But it's the mindset that should be changed. Like, depending of what I have to build, I have to partner with people that are related to what the user will do in that space. Will be, for example, extremely strange to build, even on the side of the pandemic, like build a school without listening to teachers. This is something that should never happen. Will have to be like completely strange in the near future to design indoor spaces without thinking about ventilation. It's happening with tuberculosis, with like through the whole hygienist period. It's happening again now with COVID. So it's a recurrent thing. Water and sanitation. Like, we should never build anything that is not taking into consideration the way you are cleaning the space or the access to water. We should never build anything that doesn't take in consideration the possible hazards that are there. If I have a tsunami-prone area, it doesn't make any sense that I'm planning a city on the coastline. If I have an earthquake-prone area, it doesn't make any sense that I'm building without thinking about how the structure will resist. About flooding, maybe my structure should be elevated if I don't have the money to control the water flow, as in many developing countries. So all of this, it needs a multidisciplinary approach, but it needs a different mindsetting. We should think about not just about how beautiful is the object, that is important, but is not the only thing.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. When emergency architecture fails to help in some places, maybe due to lack of money or lack of interest from the mass media, the people decide to act independently, to have their own right to housing. And this is how many slums were born. My question is, what is the best way to intervene in these realities characterized by an architectural structure already consolidated?
I think it was 3 years ago or 2 years ago, I don't remember. They invited us to Scuola Cidade in Sao Paulo for a 10 days workshop. And I met a very interesting student. She was like living in informal settlements in Sao Paulo. And actually, like, while studying, her work was to share the knowledge that she was acquiring with the community. And we went with her one day. It was extremely small intervention, but that were improving the standard of living of the family and the people living within the housing itself. For example, like, one of the main problems, for example, in formal settlement and also in area for like the Palestinian camp in Lebanon, where we are working, is health problem that are due to respiratory problem because there is no sun and there is not enough air, right? And this is the same thing in whatever very dense spaces. So one of the things that she was actually doing is to try to understand how the ventilation was working and trying to improve the ventilation system in not thinking at the apartment itself, but thinking about the whole building with the very, very cheap solutions. So basically, she was putting together, if there was a problem, if one family was having a problem, she was putting together the community of the building and working together to try to solve the problem, for example, ventilation. Or toilets, sewage system. Of course, to do a sewage system on entire informal settlement, you need huge investments. That, of course, it needs World Bank, government support, like very big investor. And not all the time governments want this investor to put there, because it's meaning that you are consolidate legally, like the people to stay there. So, and this is the same that's happening, for example, in refugee camps. So this small intervention, there was a super interesting project done in India, if you remember, just with the light. So like they were using chlorine and water, and they were creating lights inside, just inside bottles. This small intervention that it's also can go to the scale of the product design, they can have a huge impact when you don't have big investments. But you can do that just if you are working extremely closely and for a long time with the local population. Because it's very difficult to come from out. For example, the majority of these small interventions, successful intervention, are done by people that live in the country, right? It's their they know the challenges and they will solve it. And maybe our support can be just the technical part. How we can improve the idea that they have technically. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good.
It's gone. Michele, can you hear us?
I'm here, but I don't know why the other device doesn't work. It's fine. I'm coming back here.
Yeah, no problem.
But I can hear you, so you can shoot the other question if you want.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I can read a question that was written on the YouTube chat. If you hear me, I can read it. It's on the our chat. Alejandra Rivera asks, how do you recommend to try to reconcile private investors' economic interests in the built environment with community interests of protection of social and human rights in the same setting?
Mm-hmm. There are different ways. And everyone is different depending on the location, of course. But it's an old thought to believe that development can be done without the support of the private sector, because I repeat, is where there are the majority of the knowledge, the majority of the money, the investment. So there is a need of strict rules at the beginning of the partnership. So even though the investor won't, of course, make money, but there are different kinds of investors that is developing more and more. For example, there is it's surging like more and more what is called impact investment, where investor, for example, they want, of course, their money back, or at least a percentage of their money back of the investment, but it's not the only thing. They want an impact that can be social, environmental, etc. So that set of rules it's something that should be done at the beginning of the partnerships. But I can see that there is a really a movement even in the investment sector that it's started with the climate, but it's moving also into other sector. That it's really like trying to understand how to make an impact with investment of their money.
Thank you. If we have still a few minutes, I don't know if there are any other questions.
No, I think no, but if you have some questions, Valeria.
I would like to follow up on this last answer, but really shortly about the impact and effect. So you were saying in your lecture that the world is becoming increasingly complex, and in this sense, I think that it is quite impossible, no, to understand everything before acting in a complex setting as the ones that you showed us. Mm-hmm. Of course, interdisciplinarity is a fundamental tool to increase the angles of perspective, to increase the knowledge, to support the project. But in a way, it is virtually impossible to have a sufficiently reliable projection of the effects of your project in very complex setting. So my question is, how do you assess the effects, for example, of a previous project when you start to undertake a new one?
Yeah, like normally they all our projects are following basically a monitoring and evaluation process. So like we are monitoring like during the project, and after you do an evaluation, and the evaluation is done like sometimes for certain part like together with the community, and some other time from an external monitoring evaluation expert. And like basically we are building reports on each project, and we are trying to be as tough as possible, to not repeat, of course, like the same error. And I think it's also correct to say that, you know, not all our projects are perfect, you know, and it's very interesting to, of course, like internally, like to discuss what were, you know, the error that we make, like when we didn't involve the community, where we involved too much the community, you know, so like where we didn't put together, when we forgot some stakeholder to sit at the table. All these things are things that are part of the process to improve the project. And always, especially for example in the Classroom for All initiative, being under the same umbrella, there will be and looking at the same objective, there will be a lot of connection between the different projects we are doing. So in the project after the following process, actually, that's the one, for example, in Uganda, you know, will be a big problem if they repeat the same error, because for sure there will be errors in the one in Uganda, because it's how it works. It just, you know, like at the 100 classrooms that we are going to build, I hope that will be less and less error compared to the one that we will build in Uganda. But it need, you know, a really critical point of view that is not simple, but it's always very good to work with anthropologists into that, because they are very good on criticize the process, and this, you know, like dialogue, it's very important.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, I think that we are right on time.
Yeah, for once.
For once. So again, Michele, thank you so much for your lecture and for your time, for answering all of our questions. And we really hope to see you again soon, maybe in another occasion.
Thank you to all of you, and I hope, like our work, it's bringing more than answer questions to all of you, and I think it's really like what is needed in our field, but not just in our field. Just really try to understand and ask the right questions. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You
You too.
Ciao. Bye bye.
Ciao, grazie.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao. Ciao.